Hello and welcome to the first Matrix Live of 2024. And for this first Matrix Live, I have a first timer on Matrix Live, Bram, who is the author of the Matrix Elm SDK and its current maintainer. Bram, hello and welcome. Can you tell us a bit more
Yes,
about who you are and how you got involved in Matrix in the first place?
yes. My name is Bram. I'm a student in mathematics who's very interested in computer science. And the reason that I joined Matrix was because at some point Facebook started to change their terms of service for WhatsApp. And then I really wanted to leave WhatsApp because of their terms of service. And I thought it's quite a bummer that I have to stick to WhatsApp because everyone else around me is using WhatsApp. And I would love it if I could just use whatever and people could also choose something for themselves, their own client, and then it would just interoperate. And Matrix turned out to be exactly that. So I got very enthusiastic. I got into the project, the ecosystem. I just looked around for multiple things to do. And then, yeah, this kind of stuck with me. So now I'm kind of working on the Elm SDK.
All right, so you are the maintainer of that SDK. It's not a foundation project. It's a project you started on your own. So for people who are not necessarily familiar with Elm, can you remind us briefly what it is and what it's usually used for?
Yes. Well, Elm describes itself as a delightful language for reliable web applications. And kind of the train of thought behind the language is that there's a compiler, and the compiler is very strict. But as soon as the compiler allows your code and compiles it correctly, then you may assume that it will just work. And they kind of claim that you never have any runtime errors, which isn't exactly true, but it is rare to a point that you really don't think about it. Which allows the language to be used for very reliable web applications, and it's also very easy to build a very solid web application in very little time. So there have been projects actually that used Elm before in the Matrix ecosystem, and I thought, most of those projects just kind of used the Matrix API, but they never really did it in a proper way. So I decided to go out there and just try to build a library that everyone who uses Elm can actually use for themselves.
All right, so you mentioned it's made for building web apps, reliable web apps. There is a Matrix JS SDK already. So why did you decide to work on a Matrix Elm SDK?
Yeah, great question. It's partially because Elm doesn't allow necessarily to use JavaScript libraries. It's or at least that it has to be used by the user because the language kind of claims that a library should always work everywhere and you shouldn't rely on existing JavaScript libraries. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because I have noticed quite a lot around me that especially for new people to the Matrix ecosystem, the Matrix JavaScript SDK can kind of be a bit intimidating. There's a few legacy functions. There's a few functions that are kind of still there but not recommended to use. The version updates very quickly. So there are multiple reasons that make it kind of difficult for people to go through the documentation, if there's any documentation for functions at all. So for that reason, I kind of decided to, since I'm not that familiar with JavaScript myself, but I am quite familiar with Elm, I decided to kind of try and see how possible it is to make an alternative that's a bit more, a bit less intimidating, and then perhaps also a bit more easy to step into because it wasn't built by an entire team of people, but just by one person. So if it was built by one person, then it also kind of has to remain small and not get too big and not get too complex to use for a single other person.
Right, makes a lot of sense. So indeed, when projects are growing, they tend to gain in complexity, not just for the fun of it, but because they tend to be more feature complete and to cover a lot
Exactly.
of use cases.
Yeah.
So since you pointed out that you are a single person working on the SDK, can you tell us what is the project current status? What can it do, and what are the limitations of the SDK?
Yes. So the Elm SDK is currently in its beta status, which of means that we finished the alpha status recently, and the alpha status was just there's a GitHub project out there, and if you're familiar with how to manually install Elm libraries onto your computer, then you can kind of try and poke around with it. There's actually something that we made with the alpha version, which I can show you in a bit. Beta version at the moment basically means that there is a library that you can install from the public registry. Right now, that one is very limited because it's being built in a way that it's, well, fits the public registry, which has a few rules and constraints which are very strict. Um, which kind of means that if you're not familiar with Elm, there's not a lot to try. But if you're kind of familiar with the language, you can already try and look for it on the public registry and kind of see whether you like how the SDK is shaped and whether there's any tips and recommendations that you have.
So in terms of feature set that Matrix supports, so is it possible to use the SDK to send messages, receive messages, support end-to-end encryption, threads, calls?
Yes. So currently it's mostly focused on instant messaging. So it can send messages, it can send reactions. It also supports some stuff like account data that can be tied to rooms or to the accounts. Currently, end-to-end encryption is not something that will be implemented, as well as for VoIP and calls and stuff like that. It's well because I'm on my own, of course, and because at first I thought it wouldn't be very realistic for a single developer to create an entire encryption library. I've recently learned that it might not be as difficult as I had previously expected. So maybe if I happen to have some extra time in the future, I might well take a try at it. But for now, it's mostly going to be on instant messaging and changing room permissions. And the last one is especially important because I've received funding by NLNet for this project, and they've specifically funded it for the reason that I aim to build a moderation client. Right now, moderation is usually either happening through a bot that kind of requires the developer to be familiar with the command line to kind of set up the bot, or people have to do it through Element. And I'm trying to build a client that you can just use as a simple client in the browser, where you can plug in an access token or log in with your credentials. Then you have just a very simple client that's only focused on moderation, which should hopefully help a lot of people. And especially for room moderation, you don't really need end-to-end encryption. You don't need calling, because for that you can just use your main client, so to speak.
All right. So you mentioned receiving funding by NLNet. So
Yes.
you received a grant to allow you to work. You're going to work with that grant both on the SDK and on the moderation-centric client, right?
That's correct. Yes. The claim is partially that once the SDK is built, it is relatively easy to build multiple web applications that are very simple but very reliable. And I have an example that I've built before. It is a chess client. I would even claim the first chess client on Matrix that allows you to play chess on Matrix. And the idea behind it is that it's quite small. It's actually smaller than the client Hydrogen, which is made to be as compact as possible, but still contain a lot of the features that Element supports. It is smaller than that, and I mean, just like Elm kind of claims, I have not once encountered a runtime error so far. So far, it just seems to work just fine, and it's out there and still working.
All right. Before we move on to a demo, because I think you can show us the little chess client you have written.
Yes.
I just want to point out one thing. The foundation is going to publish a series of blog posts about its roadmap, and there is going to be a dedicated blog post about the trust and safety issues that the foundation is going to work on. And part of it, so spoilers, I'm going to spoil a bit ahead of time. The foundation is going to organize a working group for everybody who is interested in trust and safety work. I think it should definitely be a good idea to have you around, especially if you have a client, if you have funding to work on that, and if you have insights and opinions on what are the limitations of the current moderation tooling. Back to the SDK. So can you show us the little chess client that you wrote
Yes,
using the SDK?
I think I can. Let's see if I can share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I think you can see this now, right?
Yes, I can.
So this is basically the chess client. It's on chess.northstar.me. It is relatively easy to find. And then the thing that I'm currently skipping in the demo is that you kind of get a screen where you either plug in your access token or you can log in with the username and a password. Oh, um, this is basically what the client looks like. You can either press on the create button to create a create a chess match, or you can kind of play with other people. I basically manually set up a chess game that you are playing against yourself, so you can kind of poke around with it. And this is what the chess client looks like. So you can kind of look through the recent moves that have been made. If you're kind of if you would like, you can flip the board to view it from the other side. And of course, you can make a move. So black just made a move and it's our turn. So you know what? Let's just move this pawn forward, or I could move the queen. I could move this one, but let's just say that I move the pawn. And then basically you will kind of see it switch. It should move permanently forward. Or there we go. Sometimes it kind of lags behind because of the matrix synchronization, which is something that needs a fix for the beta version. But this is basically what it looks like. We should be able to move this one. And as you can see, it kind of bops back and forth because of the synchronization. But this is in theory just how the game works, and you can kind of play it with other people, and that's it. It's a very simple client, but it should just work very rigorously. Um, yeah, that's it.
Right, so it's a chess game, and
Yes.
so it's not at all an instant messaging game, but it's related to Matrix in the sense that all the move, all the model of what is happening on the game is actually data. It's in the form of events that you are sending in a
Yes.
room, and that the Elm SDK is reading, right?
That's correct. Yes, it's partially using timeline events where it just sends event to the timeline and saying, "Hey, I made this move," and at the same time, it is using account data, which is something that I haven't seen being used a lot. Generally, a lot of Matrix projects start using the state events in the room, where they basically describe certain information that needs to be remembered, like an ongoing chess match as a state event, although that raises some limitations because not everyone can play with the room state and not everyone's allowed to. So what I instead decided to use is the account data, which is basically just private information that you can give to the server, where you basically say to the server, I want you to remember this about the room. And that's usually where I store the chess match, where I store the state of the game, and then I'm basically just telling my client this is the state, and if it's someone else's turn, then just look for moves out there on the timeline and see if you see a valid move, and if so, then update our state in the account data, and that is basically how you keep track of a chess match.
Okay, that's an interesting approach to using Matrix for something else that
Yeah,
than instant
yeah, thank
messaging.
you.
So we've been talking a little bit about sustainability in the sense that you got funding by NLNet to work on the projects, both on the SDK and the moderation client.
Yeah.
You told me that you are working on the client, but is it something that you want, or are you open to receiving external contributions? Are PRs welcome, for example?
Oh, yes, they are very much welcome. I have to say that I have mostly had help in the form of advice, where people were more familiar with certain aspects of the Matrix API, and they could help me design the SDK in a more indirect way, but contributions are most definitely welcome. I currently don't have a lot of experience on making it accessible for other people to contribute, but I do think that the code is very well documented. Every module has full documentation on how every function works. So yes, contributions are very much welcome.
So you're saying contributions are very welcome. Contributions can be code. Are you interested in issue reports as well?
Yes. Yes.
People trying to build the SDK, build products with the SDK and reporting issues.
Yeah.
Are you also looking for potentially sponsorship beyond what NLNet is offering?
Yes, in theory. At first, I didn't really have it in mind. But right now, as I'm building the SDK, there's a few other options that are coming up with the Elm SDK that I might want to spend more time into. There's basically three things. The first thing is end-to-end encryption because it
Hmm.
turned out to be less impossible than I initially thought. The second one is that I have actually heard a lot of enthusiastic people who don't program any Elm, but who say that they can kind of interoperate with the language or they can translate it to their own language. I've heard some people programming in OCaml who said that they were going to at least consider using the SDK. The third one is, because it's kind of meant to be as an alternative to the JavaScript SDK, there are basically ways that you can use the Elm SDK in JavaScript. So I'm considering whether it might be a good option to kind of offer the Elm SDK as a JavaScript SDK alternative. Those are basically three options that I'm looking into. And if anyone's interested in that, or if they want to support the project in a different way, then sponsorships are definitely welcome. And I might be looking into either of the three, especially if there are people who are interested in those fields.
All right. What's the best way to reach out to you if somebody is interested in sponsoring you?
They can reach out to me personally. There's an Elm SDK public room, and I'm the only moderator in the room, so they can access me personally that way. Yeah, that's the best way.
All right, so I'm going to leave a link to the room in the description of the video so people can find you easily. Is there anything we forgot to mention?
Yeah, I guess the last thing is that the beta version is currently out on the package directory. It's Northstar slash Elm dash matrix dash SDK dash beta. So it's quite a long name, but if you type in Matrix SDK, you'll be fine. And if you're familiar with Elm, just please use it and kind of try and see whether it works well or that you think, well, I kind of want this to work in a different way. I'm currently really thinking about what's the most user-friendly way of implementing the API. So I think the last thing is to mention that please start using it and give me feedback on whether you like it or not.
All right. Well, thank you for your enthusiasm and for building an SDK. It's a nice addition to the Matrix ecosystem. I'm really happy to see this kind of project like popping in the wild and people just tackling the problem and going ahead. Really cool to see that. It's nice to see you are supported with a grant and that there is a little community forming around you. Really cool to see. Thanks a lot for coming to Matrix Live to share the progress with
Yeah,
us and
yeah, it
keep us
was a
posted
pleasure.
of how it's going.
Yes.
All right. See you around, Matrix Live. See you soon, Bram.
See ya.